The courtroom buzzed with the familiar hum of anticipation. Lawyers shuffled through their notes, spectators exchanged hushed whispers, and the distant echo of a gavel striking in another chamber underscored the tension. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her demeanor poised and professional. Just another case, just another day. Or so she thought. The bailiff announced the case, the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor adjusted her position slightly, her hands resting on the polished oak surface before her. Her eyes scanned the charges: assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A weary sense of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul caught in the unforgiving gears of the justice system. Then the defendant entered, shackled at the wrists and ankles. Eleanor's world tilted. The man standing before her was not a stranger. It was James Anderson, her James. A lump formed in her throat as memories surged forward. Summer afternoons spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana. Late night talks under the sprawling magnolia tree in her backyard. Childhood promises to always have each other's backs, no matter what. But the man before her was not the boy she once knew. His shoulders slumped under the weight of hardship, his face etched with years of struggle. And yet his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, remained unmistakable. Eleanor's grip on the gavel faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick with an impossible reality. James met her gaze, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes before he quickly looked away, his head bowing slightly. The courtroom waited. Eleanor forced herself to find her voice. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice, rough and nearly unrecognizable, responded, "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded. She wanted to halt the proceedings, demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their lives diverged so drastically? But she was a judge. Her duty demanded composure. "Proceed," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. As the prosecutor began the opening statement, Eleanor's mind drifted back to a time before black robes and courtrooms. She and James had grown up on opposite sides of Hammond, their lives divided by the unspoken rules of a segregated town. Her home had been modest but well kept, with a white picket fence. James's house at the end of a dirt road bore the marks of struggle. Yet their friendship had flourished in the gap society sought to keep between them. She remembered their first meeting, an accidental encounter at the creek where she had wandered too far from her backyard. James had been fishing, struggling with a tangled line. She had offered to help. That small act became the foundation of a bond that defied expectations, a bond built on secret adventures and shared dreams. One evening, as they lay beneath the stars, James turned to her. "Eleanor, you ever think about leaving this place, really getting out, somewhere people don't care that we sit together?" She had laughed, brushing off the idea. But James had seen the world for what it was, a place unwilling to make room for people like him. Their friendship was a defiant thing, yet always under siege. The disapproving glances, the whispers that turned to warnings. And then one day it ended. The summer before high school, Eleanor's father had caught them sitting together on her porch. His voice had been cold, sharp. Eleanor inside, now. She had hesitated, looking to James. His expression had been unreadable. "Go on," he said quietly. "I'll see you around." But she never did. Her father forbade her from seeing him, and soon, James's family moved away. Eleanor buried herself in school, chasing justice and ambition, climbing her way to law school and the bench. But she never forgot the boy who had shown her courage. Now, she faced the man he had become. His record showed a string of minor offenses, petty theft, loitering, nothing that spoke of a violent nature. Yet here he was, accused of assault and robbery. The prosecutor's voice snapped her back. "The evidence will show that James Anderson is guilty," he declared. Eleanor studied James. He sat slouched, hands clasped, his expression unreadable. Did he really do it? Or was there more to this case than what the prosecution presented? The trial adjourned for lunch. Back in her chambers, Eleanor's assistant, Margaret, approached cautiously. "Judge Hayes, are you okay? You seemed distracted." Eleanor hesitated. Should she confide in Margaret? Should she admit she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head. I'm fine, just a lot on my mind. But she wasn't fine. How could she be when the past she had buried now sat before her, waiting for judgment? When the trial resumed, the courtroom brimmed with tension. Reporters scribbled notes. The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to make her case. The prosecution will argue that this case is simple, she said. But it is anything but. My client is not the man they paint him to be. The truth is far more complex. Alina listened, caught between duty and memory. James had been her closest friend. Now, he was a defendant in her courtroom. The past and present collided, and she had to decide, could she judge him fairly? Could she separate her childhood bond from the weight of justice? As witnesses took the stand and evidence was presented, Alina wrestled with the undeniable truth. Justice had to be served. But justice, she knew, was never as simple as guilt or innocence. It was a story tangled in circumstance, waiting to be unraveled. James Anderson's story was far from over. Lisa stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she regarded Officer Harris with unwavering intensity. Could you have discarded it? She asked, her voice steady yet pressing. Harris's jaw tightened. He hesitated for a moment before responding. We didn't have time, he admitted, shifting slightly where he stood. He was apprehended quickly. Lisa took another step forward. Did you or any other officer conduct a search of the surrounding area to locate this supposed hoodie? Her tone carried a weight that sent murmurs rippling through the courtroom. Harris clenched his fists. No. Lisa nodded as if she had expected this answer. So, to clarify, you arrested my client based on a vague description without physical evidence linking him to the scene. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The jury exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Harris shifted uncomfortably. Officer Harris, Lisa continued, unrelenting. Do you recall if Mr. Anderson said anything at the time of his arrest? Harris exhaled sharply. He protested, said he was innocent. Lisa tilted her head. And did you consider investigating his claim, or did you assume guilt based solely on his appearance? Harris's face reddened. I followed protocol. Lisa repeated his words with a hint of skepticism. Protocol. She let the word hang in the air before shaking her head. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge nodded and the courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as Harris stepped down, his credibility visibly shaken. Alina observed everything from her seat, her heart pounding. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. Not just for James, but for a system that seemed too eager to condemn him. Lisa wasn't finished. Your Honor, she announced, the defense would like to call an expert witness. A forensic analyst stepped forward and took the stand. The courtroom stilled as the expert adjusted his glasses and began his testimony. I reviewed the surveillance footage from the night in question, he stated. Based on the height and build of the individual in the video, there is no definitive way to confirm it was Mr. Anderson. Furthermore, the timestamp on the footage had been altered. A murmur spread through the audience. Lisa leaned forward. Altered. Yes, the timestamp does not match the original system logs, indicating possible tampering. The prosecutor immediately objected. Conjecture there's no proof of intentional tampering. Overruled, the judge said. Continue. The analyst nodded. This discrepancy raises serious concerns about the footage reliability. Lisa turned to the jury, allowing the revelation to settle in their minds. Shadows of doubt flickered across their faces. As the day drew to a close, Lisa sat with James. You don't have to testify, she reminded him. It's risky. James clenched his fists. I have to. They need to hear me. The next morning, chains clinked softly as James took the stand. His voice was steady, but filled with raw sincerity. I've made mistakes in my life, he admitted. I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people, but I didn't do this. That night, I was walking home, minding my own business when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask questions. They just decided I fit the bill. His voice cracked slightly. I've spent my whole life fighting to be seen as more than what people assume about me. But this is different. I just want the truth to matter. Alina felt a lump in her throat as she glanced at the jury. Their expressions ranged from doubt to empathy, uncertainty to contemplation. The air in the courtroom felt charged, as if a battle was being waged, not just in law but in conscience. The final day of the trial dawned with a heavy sense of anticipation. The prosecutor's closing arguments relied on circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the process. But Lisa's closing argument cut deeper. "Look beyond the surface," she implored. "Consider the holes in this case. Consider the human being standing trial." Alina listened, her mind racing. She couldn't influence the jury's decision, but she would have the final word if there was any room for interpretation. The burden of ensuring justice pressed down on her. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom emptied and refilled as people stretched their legs, whispered among themselves, speculated. James sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood, her hands trembling as she held the slip of paper. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant. The pause was unbearable. Not guilty. A mixture of gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers filled the courtroom. Alina tapped her gavel, restoring order. James's shoulders sagged, but his expression remained unreadable. This was a victory, but at what cost? Alina's voice was steady. "The jury has spoken. Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, Alina lingered behind, watching James as he signed his release paperwork. He hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "But I'd like to know, why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Alina's throat tightened. The words caught. "Because I couldn't, I had to be fair. If I had spoken up, it might have jeopardized the case." James studied her, his expression a mix of hurt and understanding. "Fair." He repeated the word like it was foreign. "That's the thing, Alina, the world's never been fair, not for people like me." She nodded slowly. "You're right, I wish I had done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." James sighed, some of the tension leaving his posture. "We were kids, we didn't know any better, but you know now, don't you?" "I do," she said firmly. "And I'm sorry." James gave a faint nod, then turned and walked away, his back straight as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Alina sat alone in the empty courtroom, the weight of his words pressing on her. She had upheld the law, but the trial had revealed a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just about verdicts. It was about lives shaped by systems far larger than any one person. It was about the unseen battles, the weight of unspoken biases, the need for change. As Alina stepped out of the courthouse that evening, the fading sun casting long shadows across the steps, she made a silent vow. She couldn't change the past, but she would fight to change the future. Not with hollow promises of fairness, but with action. It would be hard, perhaps impossible, but she owed it to James, and to herself, to try. As James stepped through the courthouse doors, the world outside felt different. The air smelled fresher, the sun felt warmer, and yet the weight of everything he had endured remained firmly on his shoulders. Freedom was his once more, but it had come at a cost, one that went beyond time lost in a cell. His name had been dragged through the mud, his dignity tested, and his belief in justice shaken to its core. Lisa caught up to him on the steps, her heels clicking against the stone. "James," she called softly. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" He let out a small laugh, one that lacked humor. "You tell me, counselor." She sighed. "I know this doesn't fix everything. I know that walking free doesn't erase what you went through, but it's a start, and I promise you, I will make sure this case doesn't just fade into the system like so many others." James studied her, searching her face for any sign of insincerity, but found none. Finally, he nodded. "I appreciate that, Lisa, more than you know." As they stood there, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters, activists, strangers who had followed the case, and people who saw in James a reflection of themselves. Some held signs demanding justice for the wrongly accused. Others held phones, recording his every move. A microphone was shoved toward him. "Mr. Anderson, what will you do now?" James hesitated. What would he do? He had no job, no home to return to, no sense of normalcy waiting for him. Everything had changed. The question of what now loomed over him like a storm cloud. Live, he finally said. I'm going to live. The answer was simple yet powerful. Meanwhile, Alina remained inside, standing by the bench, her fingers trailing over the polished wood. The courtroom was nearly empty now, save for a few clerks and Margaret, who stood nearby with an understanding expression. He deserved better, Alina murmured. Margaret nodded. Many do, but the system isn't built for fairness, Alina. It's built for efficiency. You and I both know that. Alina let out a slow breath. That has to change. Margaret gave her a look. Then change it. Alina didn't reply immediately. Instead, she walked over to her chambers, shut the door, and sank into her chair. She stared at the framed diplomas on the wall, the books lining her shelves, the gavel resting in front of her. They were symbols of law and order, of justice, yet they felt inadequate now. Pulling out a notepad, she began writing. First, notes about James's case, then about similar cases she had presided over, then about the patterns she had seen time and time again. The system wasn't just flawed, it was broken. And she could no longer pretend otherwise. That night, Alina didn't go home. Instead, she stayed in her office, poring over old case files, searching for cases where justice had been compromised. Weeks passed. The world moved on as it always did, but James's case left ripples. Protests continued, legal experts debated on television, and people began to question how many others had been wrongfully accused. James himself struggled to adjust to life outside. People recognized him everywhere he went. Some treated him like a hero, others like a cautionary tale. He received job offers, book deals, even speaking engagements, but what he wanted most was peace. One evening, he found himself standing outside an old boxing gym. He had trained there as a teenager, back when life had felt simpler. He pushed the door open and was hit with the familiar scent of sweat and chalk. James. A voice called from the ring. He turned to see Coach Miller, the man who had once tried to keep him on the right path. You look like hell, son. James smirked. Good to see you too, Coach. Miller nodded toward the punching bags. You still remember how to throw a punch? James shrugged. Only one way to find out. As he wrapped his hands and stepped toward the bag, he realized that for the first time since walking out of that courtroom, he felt like himself again. Meanwhile, Alina took her first step toward real change. She submitted a proposal for a judicial review committee, one that would re-examine cases where wrongful convictions were suspected. It was met with resistance, of course, change always was. But she pushed forward, determined to use her position not just to uphold the law, but to ensure it truly served the people it claimed to protect. Lisa, on the other hand, became a voice for the wrongly accused, taking on pro bono cases and shining a light on the cracks in the system. She and James remained in touch, though their lives took them in different directions. One evening, months later, Alina received a letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Alina. I don't know if I'll ever forgive the system for what it did to me, but I can forgive you. You did what you could within the rules you had to follow. I get that now. I hope you're doing more than just following them now, though. I hope you're changing them. I thought a lot about what I want to do with my life, and I think I finally figured it out. I want to help kids who are where I was. I want to show them that just because the world expects them to fail doesn't mean they have to. Maybe then fewer people will end up where I did. Take care of yourself. And if you ever need a reminder of why you're fighting for this, come find me. It wasn't signed, but it didn't have to be. Alina folded the letter, placing it in her drawer. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right side of it. As for James, he had found his purpose. And for the first time since stepping out of that courthouse, he was finally truly free.